July 5, 1865. Justice delivered. President Andrew Johnson formally authorized the execution of 4 individuals convicted in the conspiracy to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. This decision followed a military tribunal that found 8 people guilty of involvement in the plot. The execution, carried out by hanging on July 7, 1865, marked a pivotal moment in the aftermath of the Civil War and reflected the federal government's commitment to enforce justice in the wake of a national tragedy. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln occurred on April 14, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth fatally shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The president died the following day. The attack was part of a larger conspiracy intended to destabilize the Union government by killing several high-ranking officials, including Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward. While Booth succeeded in killing Lincoln, the other attempts failed or only caused injury. Following Booth's death on April 26, 1865, federal authorities launched a nationwide effort to locate and prosecute his co-conspirators. 8 individuals were eventually arrested and tried before a military commission appointed by President Johnson. These defendants were Lewis Powell, alias Lewis Payne, David Harold, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and Edmund Spangler. The commission conducted the trial from May 10 to June 30, 1865, with the military commission finding all 8 defendants guilty to varying degrees. 4 of them, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt, received death sentences. President Johnson reviewed the commission's findings and issued an executive order on July 5, 1865, approving the executions. The authorization document was signed by Johnson and countersigned by Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. The execution took place 2 days later at the Old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington, D.C. Mary Surratt's execution was particularly notable because she became the first woman executed by the United States government. Her son, John Surratt, had been closely associated with Booth and fled the country before the trial began. Although the evidence against Mary Surratt was primarily circumstantial, the commission determined that her boarding house had been used as a meeting place for the conspirators. Lewis Powell had attempted to assassinate Secretary of State Seward on the night of April 14 by attacking him with a knife in his home. Seward survived despite serious injuries. David Harold had escorted Powell to the Seward residence and later fled with Booth before surrendering. George Atzerodt had been assigned to kill Vice President Johnson but failed to carry out the act. Each of these individuals was linked to Booth and his plans through witness testimony and documentary evidence. The use of a military tribunal, rather than a civilian court, to try the conspirators was controversial. The justification for this approach was based on the state of wartime emergency and the nature of the crimes, which were seen as acts of war against the United States government. The Supreme Court later ruled in Ex parte Milligan, 1866, that civilians could not be tried by military commissions when civilian courts were open and operational. However, at the time of the Lincoln assassination trial, Washington, D.C. was still under martial law, and civilian courts were deemed inadequate for the circumstances. President Johnson's authorization of the executions reflected his desire to demonstrate that the government would punish treason and deter future acts of political violence. It also underscored the deep national wounds left by the Civil War and the urgency of re-establishing order and authority. The execution was witnessed by a limited group of officials, reporters, and military personnel, and it was widely reported in the press. The July 5 authorization was a direct exercise of presidential power in a time of national crisis. It cemented the legal and political framework for dealing with enemies of the state at a moment when the Union was still fragile. The event remains a defining example of post-war justice and the complex legacy of Lincoln's assassination. For enthusiasts of historical ephemera, visit history-collectors.com to find collectibles that might complement your collection. You can own a piece of history.